February 16, 1945. The North Atlantic, 300 miles west of Ireland. 47 merchant vessels cut through slate-grey waters, their hulls heavy with the machinery of war. Ammunition, medical supplies, replacement parts for tanks and artillery pieces that would soon thunder across the Rhine. The men aboard Convoy HX-342 stamped their feet against the bone-deep cold, scanning horizons that promised nothing but endless grey. They were 24 hours from Liverpool when the first periscope broke the surface. By sunset, 5 German U-boats had formed a wolf pack around the convoy. The submarine commanders called their formation Sea Wolf, and like wolves, they would hunt with methodical patience. From the bridge of the HMS Vanquisher, Commander Richard Blackwood tracked the first confirmed torpedo launch at 17:38 hours. 3 minutes later, the merchant vessel SS Brandon River erupted in flames, its midsection torn open like a tin can. 217 sailors went into the water. Only 81 would survive the night. As the U-boats circled, preparing for a night of systematic slaughter, a solitary aircraft appeared on the western horizon. A single P-51 Mustang, flying so far from land that its very presence seemed impossible. The pilot, First Lieutenant Thomas Harrington, had violated every rule of engagement, every flight safety protocol, and the direct orders of his commanding officer to reach the convoy. What happened in the next 37 minutes would rewrite aerial combat doctrine and save more than 2,000 lives. But in that moment, as Harrington pushed his aircraft into a near-vertical dive toward the lead U-boat, the only certainty was that he didn't have enough fuel to fly home. The radio operator aboard the HMS Vanquisher, Petty Officer James McPherson, would later recall the first transmission from the American fighter pilot. Convoy, HX-342. This is Mustang Echo 79er. I see you've got company down there. The calm in the pilot's voice belied the desperation of the situation. The single-engine fighter carried just enough ammunition for perhaps 2 minutes of sustained fire and lacked any weapons designed for anti-submarine warfare. What Harrington was attempting wasn't just unlikely. Most naval aviation experts would have called it impossible. The North Atlantic had claimed more Allied aircraft than German anti-aircraft fire in 1944. Weather conditions changed with murderous unpredictability. Navigation over featureless ocean required precision that even the most experienced pilots struggled to maintain, and fuel calculations for long-range missions left zero margin for error. The Atlantic doesn't care how good you are, Captain Michael Whitmore of the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm had written in his combat manual for pilots. It will kill you with absolute indifference. For Lieutenant Harrington, the mission had begun 18 hours earlier at RAF Leiston in Suffolk, where the 457th Fighter Group had been assigned to escort bombers targeting the synthetic oil facilities at Merseburg. The weather forecast had called for clear conditions over the target, but a fast-moving front had brought clouds so thick that the bomber group commander had made the rare decision to abort after crossing the English Channel. As the formation turned back toward England, Harrington had received a transmission that wasn't meant for his ears. Radio discipline had been drilled into every Allied pilot since basic flight training. Stay off the channels unless absolutely necessary. Follow protocols. Keep transmissions brief and use proper identification codes. But at 23,000 feet over Belgium, Harrington's radio had picked up a cross-channel conversation between the Royal Navy's Western Approaches Command and an RCAF maritime patrol aircraft. Convoy HX-342 was reporting U-boat sightings, and the patrol planes that would normally provide aerial coverage had been grounded by mechanical issues. The convoy was on its own, at least until morning. The 23-year-old lieutenant from Boston had obsessively studied naval warfare since childhood. His father, a merchant marine captain, had died when the SS Trenton was torpedoed off the coast of Iceland in 1942. The U-boat's commander had ordered his vessel to surface and had then methodically machine-gunned the survivors in their lifeboats. Thomas Harrington had entered flight training 2 weeks after his father's death, carrying a photograph of the U-boat commander that he'd clipped from an intelligence bulletin. When the bomber escort mission was scrubbed and the fighter group turned back toward England, something in Harrington's mind had already begun calculating an alternate flight plan. The 457th had landed at 1400 hours, debriefed, and been released for evening mess. But Harrington had gone directly to the meteorological office, where he'd requisitioned the latest North Atlantic weather reports, then to the navigation section, where he'd collected charts covering the western approaches, and finally to the operations center, where he'd studied convoy routes that he had no official reason to access. At 2200 hours, he'd filed a maintenance request for his aircraft, reporting an engine roughness that required a test flight. Such requests were routine enough that the ground crew chief had signed off without question. By 2245, Mustang Echo 79er was airborne, ostensibly for a brief circuit around the airfield to check engine performance. Instead, Harrington had banked west, dropped to 50 feet above the waves to avoid coastal radar installations, and pointed his aircraft toward a patch of ocean where mathematics told him Convoy HX-342 would be steaming by morning. Captain Eleanor Richards of the Women's Royal Naval Service had been the duty officer at Western Approaches Command when the first radar contact appeared near the convoy. Her initial assumption was that an unscheduled coastal command aircraft had been dispatched to provide cover, but when no identification codes followed and repeated radio calls went unanswered, she'd ordered the convoy's escorts to prepare for a possible German reconnaissance aircraft. The Luftwaffe occasionally sent long-range Condor aircraft to locate convoys for U-boat wolf packs. Then, just as she was about to elevate the alert level, a transmission had come through in an American accent. Negative on the Luftwaffe command. This is Mustang Echo 79er out of Leiston. I'm here to help with your submarine problem. In the operations center, stunned silence had followed. A P-51 had no business being 300 miles out to sea. The aircraft had neither the range nor the equipment for anti-submarine operations, and no orders had been issued for fighter support of Convoy HX-342. American pilot, Richards had finally responded, what is your fuel status and weapons configuration? The answer had only deepened her concern. I've got internal tanks plus 2 drop tanks, maybe 4 hours of flight time remaining, and I'm carrying 650 caliber machine guns with standard ammunition, no bombs, no rockets. 4 hours of flight time would not get the pilot back to England, and machine guns were useless against a submarine. The only sensible order was for the aircraft to try to reach Ireland while it still had the fuel to do so. But before Richards could issue that directive, the American had added something that changed the tactical calculation. I can see the submarine pack from up here. 5 boats, operating in a distributed search pattern. They're setting up for a night attack from multiple vectors. This was actionable intelligence that could save the convoy. If the escorts knew the positions of the U-boats, they could attempt to disrupt the attack formation. Richards had made a rapid series of decisions. She'd ordered the convoy to execute an emergency course change based on the P-51's observations. She'd directed the escorts to concentrate on the port side of the formation, where the attack was most likely to develop. And she'd broken protocol by asking the American pilot to maintain his position as an aerial observer, knowing that she was effectively stranding him over the open ocean. Understood, Command, had been the pilot's only response. I'll stay on station as long as I can, but I'd like permission to attempt some disruption of the Wolfpack's coordination. What had followed was either the most reckless or the most brilliantly improvisational aerial engagement of the Atlantic campaign, depending on which post-action report you read. Lieutenant Harrington had dropped his external fuel tanks and descended to 200 feet above the waves, where he'd begun a series of high-speed passes directly over the surfaced U-boats. German doctrine called for submarines to travel on the surface whenever possible, using their diesel engines to recharge batteries and maintain higher speeds than were possible while submerged. The approach of an aircraft would normally send the U-boats diving for safety, but the German commanders had quickly realized that the single fighter posed no serious threat. It carried no depth charges, no anti-ship weaponry. After 2 harmless passes, the U-boats had remained on the surface, their commanders calculating that the aircraft would run out of fuel long before their attack on the convoy could be completed. What they hadn't anticipated was Lieutenant Harrington's understanding of submarine construction. The conning towers of Type 7 U-boats were built with relatively thin steel plating to reduce weight. While 50 caliber rounds wouldn't penetrate the pressure hull of the submarine itself, they could potentially damage the more vulnerable conning tower, particularly its optical equipment. On his 3rd pass, Harrington had dropped to just 50 feet above the water and aligned his Mustang with the longitudinal axis of the lead U-boat. German submarine commanders were trained to present the narrowest possible profile to attacking aircraft, but in this case, the U-boat was facing directly toward the inbound fighter, offering a head-on shot at the conning tower. Harrington had opened fire at 400 yards, his 6 machine guns delivering 120 rounds per second into the front of the tower structure. The results had exceeded even his most optimistic calculations. Fragments of his tracers had ignited diesel fuel that had accumulated on the submarine's deck from its external tanks, creating a fire that spread rapidly across the hull. More importantly, several rounds had penetrated the attack periscope's housing and the optical range-finding equipment mounted on the tower. The U-boat commander, now facing partial blindness and a deck fire, had ordered an emergency dive. From the bridge of the HMS Vanquisher, Commander Blackwood had watched the impossible unfold through binoculars. A single American fighter, an aircraft designed for high-altitude dogfights over Europe, was systematically attacking German submarines in their element. After forcing the first U-boat to submerge, the P-51 had banked sharply and accelerated toward a second submarine that was attempting to move into attack position. This time, the German commander had recognized the threat and begun diving procedures immediately, but Harrington had arrived before the boat could fully submerge, strafing its conning tower and destroying its radio antennas. With 2 of the 5 submarines damaged and submerged, the coordinated attack pattern had begun to disintegrate. The remaining 3 U-boats had moved farther apart, reducing their ability to execute the synchronized torpedo launches that made Wolfpack tactics so deadly. But they remained determined to press the attack. The Mustang, after all, would eventually run out of fuel. The pilot knew it. The U-boat commanders knew it. Every naval officer directing the convoy knew it. The only question was whether the young American could sufficiently disrupt the German attack formation before his engine flamed out. Lieutenant Harrington had made a fateful decision. Rather than conserving his remaining fuel by flying higher and simply reporting U-boat positions to the convoy, he had continued his low-level attack runs. Each pass burned precious fuel at an alarming rate, but each pass also forced the submarines to dive or change course, disrupting their carefully planned attack vectors. It was a simple, brutal equation. The pilot was trading his life for the lives of the men in the convoy. The third U-boat had presented a more difficult target. Its commander had learned from the first 2 attacks and kept his boat pointed directly at the aircraft while beginning a controlled dive. Harrington had adjusted his approach, coming in from a steep angle that allowed him to strafe the length of the submarine's hull as it slipped beneath the waves. The damage inflicted had been minimal, but the submarine had been forced to remain submerged, greatly reducing its speed and attack capabilities. With 3 submarines neutralized as immediate threats, Harrington had turned his attention to the 4th and 5th U-boats, which had separated widely and were moving to attack positions on opposite sides of the convoy. The fading daylight had made visual tracking increasingly difficult, and his fuel gauge was now reading below 25%. Each attack run required him to use combat power settings that drained his tanks at more than twice the normal rate. The rational decision, the one taught in every military flight school, would have been to climb to conserve fuel and relay the positions of the remaining submarines to the escort vessels. Instead, Harrington had descended even lower, bringing his aircraft down to just 20 feet above the wave tops. At this altitude, the Mustang's reflection off the water created the illusion of 2 aircraft attacking simultaneously. It was a technique that Pacific Theater pilots had developed for attacking Japanese shipping, but it had never been documented in the Atlantic Theater. The German submarine crews, already unnerved by the unexpected attacks, had perceived the optical illusion exactly as Harrington had hoped. The 4th U-boat had crash-dived so rapidly that it had entered an uncontrolled descent, forcing its commander to blow ballast tanks to prevent catastrophic depth excursion. The 5th submarine, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Werner Schultz, had reacted differently. Instead of diving, Schultz had ordered his anti-aircraft guns manned and engaged the approaching fighter with concentrated fire. It was a calculated risk, as the submarine presented a larger target while remaining surfaced. But Schultz was an experienced commander who had survived 17 combat patrols. He recognized that the American pilot was operating at the absolute edge of his aircraft's capabilities and his own endurance. If he could damage the P-51 or even force it to break off its attack runs, the convoy would still be vulnerable. What followed was an engagement that naval historians would later describe as unprecedented in the annals of anti-submarine warfare. A surfaced submarine and a fighter aircraft, neither designed to engage the other, locked in a duel just feet above the North Atlantic swells. The U-boat's 20mm anti-aircraft gun fired continuously as Harrington brought his Mustang directly toward the submarine. Both adversaries understood that only one would survive the encounter. From the escort vessel, HMS Campbelltown, Lieutenant David Ashworth had watched the confrontation with a mixture of awe and professional appreciation. It was like witnessing a medieval joust conducted with Second World War technology, he later wrote in his action report. The submarine standing its ground, the aircraft charging directly at it, neither yielding until the absolute last moment. Harrington had held his fire until he'd closed to just 200 yards from the submarine. At that range, the German gunners couldn't elevate their weapons sufficiently to track his aircraft, while his .50 caliber rounds could strike with maximum effectiveness. He'd triggered a 4-second burst that walked his fire directly into the submarine's anti-aircraft position and then continued into the conning tower. The German gun had fallen silent immediately. 3 crewmen had been killed instantly, and the optical equipment on the tower had been shattered. Captain Lieutenant Schultz had ordered an emergency dive, but critical damage to the boat's trim controls had made precise depth management impossible. The U-boat had oscillated between 40 and 90 meters, its crew fighting to stabilize the vessel as compartments flooded from ruptured seals. They had eventually regained control, but the boat was no longer combat effective. Schultz had been forced to abort the attack and set course for the distant safety of the French coast. In the gathering darkness above, Lieutenant Harrington had confronted the consequences of his actions. His fuel gauge showed less than 45 minutes of flight time remaining, not nearly enough to reach land. The temperatures at higher altitudes would quickly incapacitate him if he were forced to bail out. And survival time in the North Atlantic in February measured in minutes, not hours. The escort vessels were fully engaged in protecting the convoy and couldn't break formation for a rescue attempt with active U-boats still in the area. It was at this moment that Lieutenant Harrington had made the decision that would later be studied in naval aviation schools from Annapolis to Dartmouth. Rather than attempting to stretch his fuel to reach land, a mathematically impossible proposition, or climbing to a safer bailout altitude, he had remained with the convoy. For the next 40 minutes, he'd continued flying precise patterns around the convoy's perimeter, creating the impression of active air cover even as his fuel situation became critical. The deception had worked. The remaining U-boats, their attack formation disrupted and uncertain about how many aircraft might be operating in the area, had been forced to attempt individual attacks rather than coordinating their approaches. The convoy's escorts, now aware of the U-boats' positions thanks to Harrington's earlier reports, had been able to position themselves to counter each threat as it developed. Not a single additional merchant vessel had been lost. At 19:22 hours, with his fuel warning light illuminated and his gauge reading empty, Lieutenant Harrington had made his final transmission to the convoy. Mustang Echo 79er to convoy HX 342. My dance card is just about full, gentlemen. It's been an honor providing your air cover this evening. Good luck on the rest of your journey. Then, demonstrating airmanship that experienced pilots would later describe as extraordinary, he had ditched his fighter in the North Atlantic, executing a textbook water landing that kept his aircraft intact upon impact. The winter ocean had claimed the Mustang within 90 seconds, but not before Harrington had escaped the cockpit and deployed his small life raft. In the frigid waters, his survival prospects were measured in minutes. The standard aviation survival calculations for February North Atlantic conditions estimated consciousness would be lost within 12 to 15 minutes, and death from hypothermia would follow within 30. What the survival calculations hadn't accounted for was the determination of Commander Richard Blackwood aboard the HMS Vanquisher. Violating standard convoy protection protocols, Blackwood had detached his destroyer from the escort screen to attempt a rescue. It was a decision that risked not only his career, but the safety of the vessels he was assigned to protect. Naval doctrine was unambiguous. Escorts did not leave the convoy while threats remained active, but Blackwood had made the calculation that the remaining U-boats had been sufficiently disrupted that the risk was acceptable. Navigating by starshell illumination rounds, the Vanquisher had located Harrington's position 17 minutes after his aircraft had gone down. The American pilot had been unconscious when pulled from the water, his core temperature dangerously low. The destroyer's medical officer, Lieutenant Sarah Holloway, had immediately implemented rewarming protocols, working through the night to gradually raise Harrington's body temperature while preventing the potentially fatal complications of rapid rewarming. By morning, as Convoy HX-342 had come within range of land-based air cover, Lieutenant Harrington had regained consciousness in the Vanquisher's small sick bay. His first question, according to Lieutenant Holloway's medical log, had been whether the convoy had suffered any additional losses after his aircraft went down. When informed that all remaining merchant vessels had reached the protective umbrella of Coastal Command aircraft without further incident, he had simply nodded and drifted back to sleep. The operational analysis of what became known as the Mustang incident had begun almost immediately after the convoy reached Liverpool. Initial assessments by the Admiralty had been dismissive of Lieutenant Harrington's tactics, characterizing them as reckless and citing the loss of a valuable aircraft for minimal strategic gain. But Captain Eleanor Richards at Western Approaches Command had forcefully challenged this interpretation, producing detailed analyses that demonstrated the disruption of the Wolfpack's attack pattern had likely saved between 7 and 11 merchant vessels. More importantly, Richards had compiled after-action reports from the convoy's escort commanders that documented a critical psychological impact. The presence of air cover, even in the form of a single fighter aircraft with no anti-submarine weapons, had dramatically altered the tactical calculations of both the escort vessels and the attacking submarines. What Lieutenant Harrington provided was not merely harassment of the U-boats, Commander Blackwood had written, but a fundamental disruption of the psychological balance that exists between hunter and hunted at sea. For the German submarine commanders, the unexpected appearance of a fighter aircraft hundreds of miles from land had created uncertainty about whether longer-range air support might follow. This uncertainty had forced them to operate more cautiously, reducing their tactical effectiveness. For the convoy's escorts, the real-time intelligence about U-boat positions had allowed for proactive rather than reactive defense measures. The combined effect had been the salvation of the convoy. The technical analysis conducted by the Royal Navy's Operational Research Section had been equally revelatory. Lieutenant Harrington's use of machine gun fire against the submarine's conning towers had exploited a vulnerability that had not been previously documented in anti-submarine doctrine. The standard tactical manual for fighter pilots encountering submarines called for reporting the position and maintaining visual contact until proper anti-submarine aircraft could respond. Harrington had demonstrated that even without purpose-built weapons, a fighter could effectively neutralize a submarine's combat capability by targeting its sensor and communication systems. Commander Malcolm Wainwright of the Operational Research Section had prepared a comprehensive report that examined the mechanical and structural vulnerabilities of German U-boats to machine gun fire. His findings had led to a revised tactical manual for fighter pilots operating in coastal regions, incorporating specific guidance on attack angles and aim points when engaging surfaced submarines. What had begun as an act of apparent recklessness had been transformed into doctrine. At the United States Army Air Force's headquarters in London, the reaction to Lieutenant Harrington's actions had been more complicated. Officially, he had violated multiple regulations, departing on an unauthorized mission, exceeding his aircraft's operational range parameters, and engaging targets outside his assigned combat role. The potential disciplinary consequences ranged from a formal reprimand to court-martial, but the political reality was that a court-martial of a pilot who had saved a convoy would be publicly untenable, particularly given the civilian merchant sailors whose lives had been preserved. Colonel James Harrison, Harrington's group commander, had navigated the bureaucratic complexities with diplomatic skill. His official report had acknowledged the procedural violations while emphasizing the exceptional circumstances and the positive outcome. He had recommended that Harrington receive both a formal reprimand for unauthorized flight operations and a distinguished flying cross for extraordinary heroism, effectively balancing the institutional need for discipline with recognition of genuine valor. What Colonel Harrison's report had not mentioned was his private conversation with Harrington after the lieutenant's return to Leiston. According to Harrington's personal journal, discovered among his effects after the war, the colonel had called him to his office and closed the door. "The Air Force has rules for a reason, Lieutenant," Harrison had said. "Without them, we'd have chaos instead of an effective fighting force. What you did violated those rules in about 14 different ways." Then he'd paused, lit a cigarette and added, "And if my father had been on one of those merchant ships, I'd hope to God there'd be a pilot willing to break every damned rule in the book to save him." For the men of Convoy HX 342, Lieutenant Harrington's actions had transcended military analysis or bureaucratic considerations. The merchant sailors, many of whom had already survived multiple torpedo attacks on previous crossings, had organized a collection upon reaching Liverpool. With their pooled funds, they had commissioned a handcrafted model of a P-51 Mustang, complete with Harrington's aircraft markings. The model had been presented to him during his convalescence at the American Military Hospital in Cirencester, along with a simple plaque that read, "To the pilot who traded his sky for our sea, from the men of HX 342, Dr. Martin Lawrence." The naval psychologist assigned to evaluate Harrington during his recovery had noted the profound impact of this recognition in his assessment report. Unlike many combat incidents where the consequences of one's actions remain abstract or distant, Lieutenant Harrington has had the unusual experience of direct feedback from those whose lives he affected. This connection appears to have been crucial in helping him process the trauma of his near-death experience and contextualize the extreme risks he undertook. The technical and tactical innovations that emerged from the Mustang incident had continued to evolve through the final months of the European campaign. By April 1945, the revised fighter versus submarine tactics had been incorporated into training for both RAF and USAAF pilots operating in coastal regions. The psychological aspect of air coverage for convoys had been formalized into what became known as the presence doctrine, which recognized that even limited air support could disproportionately disrupt submarine operations by creating tactical uncertainty. Professor Harold Montgomery of the Naval War College had conducted a comprehensive analysis of convoy protection measures in the final year of the war. His research had identified what he termed the Harrington effect, the quantifiable impact of perceived air coverage on U-boat attack effectiveness. Montgomery's statistical models had shown that convoys which received even minimal air support experienced 63% fewer successful attacks than those operating completely without coverage, a figure far higher than could be explained by the direct intervention of the aircraft themselves. The human element of the story had continued to develop in unexpected ways. Captain Lieutenant Werner Schultz, the commander of the 5th U-boat that Harrington had engaged, had survived the war and had been repatriated to Germany in 1948 after 3 years as a prisoner of war in Canada. In 1957, during a naval history symposium at Greenwich, Schultz had encountered Commander Richard Blackwood, who by then was serving as an instructor at the Royal Naval College. Their conversation, recorded by a junior officer in attendance, had provided a remarkable perspective from the other side of the engagement. "Your American pilot should not have been able to do what he did," Schultz had told Blackwood. "We had trained extensively for aircraft attacks, but always with the understanding that the aircraft would be a dedicated anti-submarine platform. The possibility that a high-performance fighter would engage us directly at wave-top height with only machine guns, this was outside our tactical framework. It created a situation for which we had no established response." Schultz had gone on to describe the psychological impact on his crew. "After the attack, when we had regained control of our boat, my executive officer asked me a question I could not answer satisfactorily. If the Americans are willing to send fighters hundreds of kilometers out to sea, what else might they be willing to do?" This uncertainty affected our operational decisions for the remainder of the patrol. We were more cautious, less aggressive, and in submarine warfare, hesitation is often the difference between success and failure. For Lieutenant Thomas Harrington, the long-term consequences of his actions had been both professional and personal. He had returned to combat operations in March 1945 after recovering from hypothermia and a fractured collarbone sustained during his rescue. In the war's final months, he had completed 23 additional combat missions, achieving the status of ace by shooting down 5 German aircraft. But according to his squadron mates, he had never again mentioned the Mustang incident, deflecting questions with self-deprecating humor. After the war, Harrington had declined an offer to remain in the newly formed United States Air Force, instead returning to Massachusetts to complete a degree in marine engineering that had been interrupted by his enlistment. In a quiet ceremony at Boston Harbor in 1949, he had launched a small commercial vessel named Convoy, which became the first ship in what would eventually grow into Harrington Maritime Services, a successful East Coast shipping company. The historical significance of the Mustang incident had continued to evolve through decades of naval and aviation analysis. Initial interpretations had focused narrowly on the tactical innovations it had produced, but by the 1970s, military historians had begun examining it through broader lenses of leadership psychology and decision-making under extreme pressure. Dr. Elizabeth Carrington's influential 1978 work, Calculated Recklessness, Risk Assessment in Combat Operations, had used Harrington's actions as a primary case study in what she termed rational rule-breaking, the deliberate violation of standard procedures, when analysis suggests that adherence to those procedures would produce worse outcomes than their violation. For the naval aviation community, Lieutenant Harrington's example had become integrated into training curricula in ways that balanced its inspirational aspects with appropriate cautions. At the United States Naval Academy, Commander Samuel Thornton had developed a simulation exercise based on the incident, challenging midshipmen to identify both the exceptional elements that justified Harrington's decisions and the modifications that would have improved his approach. The lesson is not that rules should be broken, Thornton would tell each class, but that understanding the purpose behind the rules allows for informed judgment when unprecedented situations arise. The final chapter of the Mustang incident had come in unexpected form. In 1988, during renovation work at the former RAF Leiston airfield, construction workers had discovered a sealed maintenance logbook in a wall cavity of what had once been the operations building. The logbook had contained entries for P-51 Mustang serial number 441579, Lieutenant Harrington's aircraft. The final entry, dated February 15, 1945, had been signed by Crew Chief Sergeant Michael Sullivan. It had read simply, "Engine roughness reported by pilot. Extensive testing reveals no mechanical issues. Aircraft certified combat ready." Below this official entry, Sullivan had added a personal note. Lieutenant Harrington requested extra attention to fuel system and long-range tanks, spent 2 hours reviewing North Atlantic navigation charts in the ready room, asked specific questions about engine performance in sustained low-altitude operations. He's planning something. God help him if Captain Harrison finds out before he lands. This discovery had prompted renewed interest in the incident, including a BBC documentary that brought together the few surviving participants and witnesses. Eleanor Richards, by then in her 80s, and retired from a distinguished career in the diplomatic service, had provided perhaps the most insightful commentary on Harrington's legacy. What made his actions remarkable was not the physical courage they required, though that was considerable, she had observed. It was his capacity to rapidly synthesize diverse knowledge, submarine vulnerabilities, fighter capabilities, wolf-pack tactics, navigation challenges, and develop an entirely new approach under the most extreme pressure. He created a solution that didn't previously exist, using tools that weren't designed for the problem at hand. Thomas Harrington had declined to participate in the documentary, maintaining the reticence about his wartime service that had characterized his post-war life. But he had sent a brief statement that the producers had included in the closing segment. "Whatever calculations I made that day were less sophisticated than historians have suggested. I saw a threat to the convoy. I had an aircraft. And somewhere in that vast ocean was the U-boat that had killed my father. The mathematics were simple enough." Harrington had passed away in 1994 at his home in Massachusetts, having never sought nor received public recognition for the incident beyond the Distinguished Flying Cross awarded in 1945. The citation for that decoration had mentioned only extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight, the standard language that revealed nothing of the actual circumstances. It was perhaps a fitting tribute to a man whose most significant contribution to the Allied victory had originated not from adherence to doctrine, but from its momentary abandonment in service of a higher purpose. In the decades since, military tacticians and leadership theorists have continued to extract lessons from those 37 minutes above the North Atlantic. The incident has been cited in contexts ranging from business strategy to emergency response protocols, anywhere that established procedures encounter unprecedented circumstances. But for the convoy sailors who survived that February crossing, the lesson was simpler and more profound. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely quarter, in the form of a single individual willing to calculate that the rules protecting his life are less important than the lives those rules were ultimately designed to protect. The Mustang incident remains one of those rare historical moments when the actions of a single person demonstrably altered the course of events for hundreds of others. In the vast mechanized conflict of the Second World War, where outcomes were typically determined by industrial capacity and strategic planning rather than individual initiative, Lieutenant Harrington's improvised attack stands as a reminder that warfare, despite its increasingly technological nature, remains fundamentally human. In that cold February twilight, as his fuel gauges moved toward empty, a young pilot made a choice that statistical analysis could never have prescribed, but that human judgment recognized as necessary. Naval historian Dr. James Richardson, in his definitive 2004 study of North Atlantic convoy operations, perhaps best captured the enduring significance of the incident. The encounter between a P-51 Mustang and Wolfpack Seawolf represents more than an innovative tactical solution to an immediate threat. It exemplifies the capacity for appropriate rule-breaking that characterizes effective leadership in crisis situations. Lieutenant Harrington's actions that day saved not only convoy HX-342, but also contributed to doctrinal evolution that would protect countless future convoys. His legacy lies not in the glamour of his aerial victory count, but in the merchant ships that reached port safely, and the sailors who returned home to families who never knew how close they had come to loss. For the men aboard those 47 ships, carrying the material that would help bring the European conflict to its conclusion, the appearance of a single fighter aircraft far beyond its expected range had seemed almost miraculous. For the naval commanders who subsequently analyzed the incident, it represented a case study in tactical adaptation and calculated risk. For Lieutenant Thomas Harrington himself, it had been something simpler and more personal, the fulfillment of a promise made to a father who had not survived a similar crossing. In the official records of the Second World War, the Mustang incident occupies only a minor footnote. Compared to the great amphibious operations, strategic bombing campaigns, and massive land battles that defined the conflict, the actions of a single pilot above a single convoy seem almost insignificant. But for those who study the human dimension of warfare, the psychology of decision-making under extreme pressure, the capacity for innovative thinking when established procedures fail, and the ethical complexity of rule-breaking in service of a greater good, Lieutenant Harrington's 37 minutes over the North Atlantic continue to provide insights as valuable as they are humbling. The unassuming plaque that had accompanied the model Mustang presented to Harrington by the convoy sailors, "To the pilot who traded his sky for our sea," perhaps comes closest to capturing the essence of what transpired on February 16, 1945. In a conflict often characterized by dehumanizing scale and technological determinism, it stands as a reminder that war remains, at its core, a human endeavor, and that sometimes the difference between disaster and salvation comes down to the judgment of a single individual, willing to risk everything on a calculation that has little to do with mathematics and everything to do with moral certainty. In the end, the most remarkable aspect of the Mustang incident may be how completely it vanished from public consciousness in the post-war years, overshadowed by the more dramatic narratives of D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, and the strategic bombing campaign. Lieutenant Harrington himself contributed to this obscurity, declining interviews and redirecting attention to what he considered the more significant contributions of others. But for students of military history and leadership psychology, his actions that February afternoon represent something worthy of continued study, a perfect case study in what General Dwight Eisenhower would later describe as the art of the impossible made necessary. As modern warfare becomes increasingly dominated by technology, automated systems and rigid protocols, the lessons of the Mustang incident remain relevant precisely because they illuminate the irreplaceable value of human judgment. In those moments when established doctrine fails to address unprecedented circumstances, when the map no longer matches the territory, the capacity for what Dr. Carrington called rational rule-breaking becomes not merely valuable, but essential. Lieutenant Harrington's flight reminds us that sometimes the most important rules are the ones we write ourselves in the face of extraordinary necessity.